It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of day when the sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm glow over the suburban streets of Oakwood. The gentle hum of cicadas in the trees and the occasional chirp of birds in the distance filled the air, signaling the calm of a summer afternoon. Everything felt peaceful, serene, until everything changed in the blink of an eye. Lily, my daughter, was outside as usual, a small figure in the front yard, playing with her favorite toy car. Despite her cerebral palsy, she was always so full of life, so full of wonder. Her disability had never defined her, nor had it ever dimmed her spirit. Lily was a fighter. She was resilient in ways that most people never saw. It was always a struggle for her muscles refusing to cooperate as she tried to move the toy car across the lawn, but she did it with a smile on her face. She wasn't like the other kids, but I had always believed that was what made her extraordinary. As I sat on the porch, sipping my coffee and watching her struggle to push the toy car, a sense of calm washed over me. For once, there were no hospital visits, no therapy sessions, no worries about the future. Everything felt perfect, just for a moment. But that tranquility was shattered when I noticed Karen walking down the street. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our HOA, had always had an air of superiority about her, as if she were above everyone else. She lived just down the block in one of the big houses with the perfectly manicured lawn and the spotless driveway, as if it was a testament to her idea of perfection. She had never liked Lily. In fact, I could tell she was one of those people who looked at my daughter and saw nothing more than an inconvenience, an eyesore that didn't fit into the picture-perfect image she had of this neighborhood. I had seen her eyeing Lily before, shooting us those cold, judgmental glances whenever she thought I wasn't paying attention. But I had always shrugged it off. I knew my daughter, and I knew the world would never be kind to her. Still, I never expected something like this to happen. As Karen walked up the sidewalk, I noticed her posture, arms crossed, lips pursed, eyes narrowed as if she were preparing for some sort of confrontation. I could feel the tension building in the pit of my stomach, but I tried to ignore it. This was supposed to be a peaceful afternoon, after all. Then it happened. Without any warning, Karen marched straight up to Lily. My heart skipped a beat as I watched her raise her hand, fast and deliberate, and slap Lily across the face. It was a hard slap, the kind that could leave a mark, the kind that sent a clear message. Lily's head jerked back in shock. I froze for a moment, unable to process what I was seeing. My daughter, my innocent, vulnerable child, had just been struck. I could hear Karen's voice cold and mocking as she sneered at Lily. "Don't touch that toy again, you freak!" She spat, her words venomous, cruel. It was as if Lily's mere presence, her innocent play, had become a violation in Karen's eyes. I jumped up from my chair, my heart pounding in my chest as adrenaline coursed through my veins. "Karen, what the hell is wrong with you?" shouted, my voice trembling with fury as I rushed to my daughter's side. I could see Lily's face, her wide eyes filled with confusion and pain as she cradled her cheek where the slap had landed. She didn't understand what had just happened, and it broke my heart to see her like this. Karen stood there, unfazed with a smirk on her face, as if nothing had happened. She didn't care that she had just hurt my daughter. "What are you going to do about it, huh? It's just a kid. I'm just teaching her some manners," she said dismissively, her tone dripping with condescension. I could feel my blood boil, my hands clenched into fists as I held Lily close to me. I had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when it came to my daughter, but this was something different. This wasn't just a rude comment or a petty disagreement. This was an attack, and it was personal. I took a deep breath, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You think you can just walk up to my daughter and hit her, and I'll let you get away with it?" I asked, my voice low but firm. "You're not just some neighborhood bully, Karen. You've crossed a line, and I won't stand for it." Karen's smirk faltered, but she didn't back down. She glared at me, her eyes filled with defiance. "You're overreacting," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "It's just a slap. It's not like she's really hurt." But I wasn't going to let her words cloud my judgment. I knew what had just happened. This wasn't just about a slap. This was about something deeper, something darker. Karen had tried to hurt my daughter, emotionally, physically, in a way that would leave a lasting scar, and I was done being silent. Little did Karen know, I wasn't just any parent. I wasn't someone who would back down in the face of injustice. I worked at the Department of Justice, and I knew exactly what to do. I had spent my entire career fighting for justice, ensuring that the law was applied fairly to everyone, no matter who they were. This time, the law would be on my side. I walked back inside the house, still holding Lily close to me. She didn't speak, but I could feel her trembling in my arms, her body tense as she processed what had just happened. "We're going to make sure this never happens again," I whispered to her, my words more to myself than to her. I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about defending my daughter. It was about making sure that no one else would ever have to face the same kind of cruelty, the same kind of abuse that Karen had just inflicted. I had seen enough in my career to know that people like Karen didn't change without consequences, and I was going to make sure she paid for what she had done. This was just the beginning, and I wasn't going to let anything stop me from seeing justice served. I couldn't let what happened slide. It wasn't just a moment of injustice. It was a wake-up call that demanded action. I had spent years working in law enforcement, building a reputation for knowing the right people and understanding the intricacies of the law, but nothing had prepared me for the overwhelming surge of anger and helplessness that swelled within me when someone hurt my child. I had seen criminals, perpetrators, and corrupt individuals time and again, but none of that mattered when the violation came so close to home. It wasn't just my duty as a law enforcement officer that kicked in, it was my responsibility as a mother. And I was not going to let Karen go unpunished. The moment I stepped inside the house, the shock of what had just happened settled into my bones. I didn't have time to dwell on the emotions. I had to act. I could already feel the ticking clock of time against me, knowing that Karen's actions could easily be brushed aside or forgotten by others. No one had ever dared stand up to her, not in this neighborhood. But I wasn't going to let this be another one of those instances where a bully got away with it. I headed straight for the study, opening up the file drawers where I kept all the necessary resources and contact information for the work I did at the Department of Justice. This wasn't just a personal matter. I had the skills and access to dig deeper. It was time to get to work. The first thing I did was contact a few trusted colleagues from work, ones who were experienced in handling harassment cases and who understood the complexities of law when it came to community disputes. I told them the basic details, the incident with my daughter, the known history of Karen's behavior, and my suspicion that this wasn't her first offense. They were quick to offer their support and their resources. By the end of the night, I had the groundwork laid to begin digging into Karen's background. I was no stranger to background checks. I'd done them countless times for work, but this time it felt different. It felt personal. I wasn't just looking for a criminal record, though that would certainly help my case. I was looking for patterns, for signs that this was a woman who had gotten away with too much for too long. I started looking at her history, reaching out to neighbors, even former colleagues who might have worked with her in the past. I was relentless, poring over old reports, community forums, and anything else that could give me the ammunition I needed to bring her to justice. It didn't take long before the pieces started falling into place. The first tip came from a former neighbor who had lived in Oakwood for over a decade. They had moved out a few years ago, but they were more than willing to share their experience with Karen. They described Karen as a control freak, someone who would constantly find ways to belittle people, especially those she deemed inferior. According to this person, Karen had once caused a huge rift in the community when she tried to impose unreasonable rules on the other residents. The HOA had been her domain, and anyone who crossed her was made to pay. The more I dug, the more I found. Neighbors spoke of Karen's ongoing rudeness and manipulation. There was a trail of complaints spanning over a decade, all ignored by the HOA. There were instances of Karen targeting other residents, people she deemed unworthy of her. Perfect neighborhood, people who were just trying to live their lives in peace. She had once threatened a single mother with a lawsuit over a minor landscaping issue, accusing her of violating some obscure HOA rule that didn't even exist. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This wasn't just a woman with a bad attitude. This was a person who thrived on controlling others through fear and intimidation. But it wasn't just her neighbors who had felt the wrath of Karen's cruelty. I also uncovered complaints from former colleagues who had worked with her in different settings. She had once been a supervisor at a local retail company, and the reports of her behavior there mirrored what I had found in Oakwood. One report detailed how Karen had belittled a disabled employee for not being quick enough, making cruel remarks about their disability in front of others. It was like I was uncovering an entire life of manipulation, control, and cruelty. a pattern that had been ongoing for far too long. This wasn't an isolated incident with my daughter. This was who Karen was. As the night turned into early morning, I realized that I had what I needed to start building a case. I had a disturbing pattern of harassment, bullying, and emotional abuse on Karen's part. But the truth didn't stop there. I wasn't just after her for the slap. I was after her for everything she had done to others, everything she had gotten away with. This was going to be bigger than just one incident. This was about holding someone accountable for years of unchecked behavior. I reached out to my contacts at the police department, ensuring that the right channels would be used to file a formal complaint. I wanted to make sure everything was documented properly. My colleagues were supportive, offering advice on how to move forward with the case. They understood the gravity of the situation, and they knew that people like Karen couldn't be allowed to continue their reign of terror. They offered to help with the legal side of things, making sure I had all the necessary evidence to take this to the HOA board and, if necessary, to court. But as I worked, I couldn't help but think about Lily. She hadn't said much since the incident. She was in a room, staring out of the window, lost in thought. I knew she didn't fully understand what had happened, but I could see the change in her eyes. The innocence that had been so visible in her face was now replaced with something else, something darker. She had felt the sting of someone else's cruelty. She had been a victim, and I couldn't take away the hurt in her eyes. But what I could do was make sure that Karen would never hurt anyone again. Lily had always been a bright and energetic child. Despite the struggles she faced, she was the light of my life. Seeing her like this, her usual spark dimmed by Karen's cruelty, broke my heart. But in that moment, I made a vow to myself. I was going to do whatever it took to ensure that Karen faced the consequences of her actions. I wasn't going to stop until she paid for what she had done. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. I knew that bringing Karen to justice would require more than just uncovering her past actions. It would require the courage to face her down, to expose her for who she truly was, and to hold her accountable for everything she had done. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Karen had crossed a line, and now I was going to make sure she paid for it. The truth was out there now. The truth was on my side, and I wasn't going to let anyone, not even Karen, stand in my way. The morning sun streamed through the blinds as I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers in front of me. I had already spent hours the night before preparing for what was about to happen. I was nervous, but I knew I couldn't let that stop me. This was no longer just about my daughter. It was about taking a stand against someone who had manipulated and bullied her way through life without facing the consequences. The time had come to confront Karen, and I wasn't going to back down. I picked up the phone and dialed the number of the HOA president. The call felt strangely formal for what was about to unfold, but I needed to make sure everything was set in motion. I had already made it clear that the meeting had to be scheduled, and I wasn't taking no for an answer. "Good morning. This is Sarah from Oakwood HOA," the president answered, her voice tight with professionalism. "Hi, Sarah. This is—" I began, then paused. It didn't seem necessary to introduce myself again. "I'm calling to request an emergency meeting regarding an incident involving one of our members, Karen Jenkins. It's urgent, and I expect all board members to be present." There was a noticeable hesitation on the other end, followed by a long sigh. "I see. We usually don't hold emergency meetings unless there's an urgent matter. But I understand the gravity of the situation. I'll schedule it for this afternoon." "Thank you," I said, feeling a wave of relief. It was the first step toward confronting Karen. Now it was time to make sure everything else fell into place. By the time I arrived at the HOA Community Center, the room was filled with tense faces. The large wooden table at the center of the room was surrounded by people who had either lived in Oakwood for years or had recently moved in. They were the gatekeepers of the neighborhood, the ones who decided what was acceptable and what wasn't. Normally, these meetings were full of debates about landscaping rules, complaints about loud music, or discussions about the neighborhood's shared amenities. But today, the atmosphere was different. Today, it wasn't about rules. It was about justice. I could see Karen sitting at the far end of the table, her arms crossed in a defensive posture. She had this smug, almost arrogant expression on her face, as though she didn't think she had done anything wrong. I knew that she thought her position within the HOA gave her some sort of immunity, some unspoken power that allowed her to treat others however she wanted. But today, that illusion was about to shatter. I took my seat at the opposite end of the table, making sure to sit where I could see every single person in the room. I wanted to make sure they saw me clearly when I spoke. I wasn't just here as a member of the neighborhood. I was here as a mother, and I was here as someone who was not afraid to stand up for what was right. Sarah, the president, called the meeting to order. Her voice was steady, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes as she glanced over at Karen. I knew that she had been reluctant to hold this meeting, but there was no turning back now. Everyone in the room knew what had happened. Karen's actions were no longer a secret. The rumors had spread, and now it was time for the truth to be heard. "I've called this meeting today to address a serious concern," Sarah said, her voice filling the room. "We are here to discuss an incident that occurred between one of our residents, Karen Jenkins, and another member of this community. I'd like to give Karen the opportunity to explain her side of the story." Karen stood up, her eyes scanning the room. She took a deep breath, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But she quickly recovered, putting on that smug expression once again. "I don't know what this is all about," Karen began, her voice dripping with feigned innocence. "I don't know why we're even having this meeting. I was simply trying to keep the peace and teach a lesson to someone who doesn't understand how to behave in our neighborhood. This whole thing is being blown out of proportion." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Her audacity was unbelievable, and my anger started to simmer just below the surface. I stood up, not letting her finish. I knew that I had to address this now, before she had a chance to spin the story into something else. "I have a problem with how one of our members has been behaving," I said, my voice cutting through the room. I could feel the eyes of every person in the room on me, but I didn't falter. "I'm sure you've all heard about the incident with Karen and my daughter Lily." The room fell silent. I could see Karen's face turn pale. She hadn't expected me to take control like this, to address the issue so directly. She glanced at Sarah, then back at me, her smirk fading as the reality of the situation sank in. "You have no right to bring that up here," Karen snapped, her voice shaking with anger. She was trying to maintain her composure, but I could see the cracks forming. "This is supposed to be about neighborhood issues, not personal attacks." "I have every right," I replied calmly, my voice unwavering. "As a member of this community, I demand accountability. And as someone who works for the Department of Justice, I will not allow this to go unpunished." I could see the hesitation in the faces of the other HOA members. They were uncomfortable, unsure of how to handle the situation. This wasn't a normal complaint about lawn care or a noisy dog. This was something far more serious. I could feel their unease, but I also knew that this was exactly what had to happen. The truth had to come out, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. One of the board members, a middle-aged man with glasses, cleared his throat. "I think we should look into this further," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We can't just let something like this slide. We need to investigate the situation properly." "I agree," another member chimed in. "This needs to be addressed. It's clear that something is wrong here, and it's affecting the integrity of our community." Karen's expression faltered for the first time. She looked around the room, and I could see the panic rising in her eyes. She was used to controlling situations, used to getting her way, but this time was different. The HOA members were no longer blindly following her lead. They were starting to see her for who she really was. The board members unanimously agreed to open an investigation into the incident, and Karen was immediately placed on temporary suspension, pending the outcome. She was no longer in charge, and her hold over the neighborhood was slipping. As the meeting continued, I could feel a sense of satisfaction building inside me. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been intimidated or bullied by Karen. It was a small but significant step toward holding her accountable, toward making sure she could never hurt my daughter or anyone else again. I walked out of the meeting with my head held high. I had done what needed to be done. The investigation would continue, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like justice was within reach. I had taken a stand, and I wasn't backing down. The first few days after the HOA meeting were a whirlwind. The investigation that I had set in motion was now fully underway, and it didn't take long for the floodgates to open. My colleagues at the Department of Justice had jumped into action immediately, helping me navigate the legal aspects and pulling the necessary resources together to build a solid case against Karen. They knew how important this was to me, how personal it had become, and they were fully committed to ensuring justice was served. As the days went by, I began to realize just how much I had underestimated the scope of Karen's actions. What I had thought was an isolated incident turned out to be part of a much darker pattern. The first significant breakthrough came when a few of Karen's former neighbors reached out to me. These were people who had lived in Oakwood for years, some even decades, and they had seen Karen in her prime as the queen of the HOA. They had their own stories, many of which they had never shared with anyone before, out of fear of retaliation, or simply because they didn't think their voices mattered. But now, with the investigation in full swing, they were ready to speak out. One of the neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Carson, had lived in Oakwood for nearly 30 years. She had watched the neighborhood evolve over time, and over the years, she had become increasingly disturbed by Karen's behavior. Mrs. Carson explained that Karen had always been a bit of a control freak, but she'd only gotten worse with time. She has this way of making people feel small, like they don't belong, Mrs. Carson told me over the phone. She'd do things like fine people for trivial matters, like their grass being a little too long or a mailbox being slightly crooked. And if you didn't comply, she'd threaten to take you to court or get the HOA board involved. She was ruthless. It wasn't just the petty infractions that bothered people, though. Mrs. Carson shared stories about Karen going after people who were already struggling. There was one incident where Karen had insisted that a family with a disabled child move their car out of the driveway, even though it was perfectly legal to park there. The family had explained that the child was undergoing medical treatments and needed access to the car at all hours, but Karen had refused to listen, citing some obscure HOA rule about parking space. That family had eventually moved out of Oakwood, unable to bear the constant harassment. The more stories I heard, the more I realized that Karen wasn't just a bad neighbor. She was a bully. She had taken full advantage of the power that her position in the HOA gave her, using it to intimidate and manipulate people into doing her bidding. She didn't care about the well-being of anyone else. All she cared about was maintaining her control over the neighborhood, a control that was built on fear and domination. But what truly shocked me were the legal records that started to surface. My connections at the Department of Justice had been able to dig up Karen's criminal background, which she had kept well hidden. The moment I saw the report, a chill ran down my spine. Karen had been involved in multiple lawsuits over the years, and each one had stemmed from her aggressive and often abusive behavior toward others. There were lawsuits related to harassment, property damage, and even personal injury claims. In one case, she had sued a neighbor for emotional distress after a minor dispute about their shared fence. The neighbor had won the case, but the legal battle had been so exhausting and draining that they eventually left the neighborhood to escape Karen's continued harassment. There were also criminal charges that Karen had managed to get expunged. One charge was for assault. It had happened several years ago when Karen had gotten into a heated argument with a woman over some neighborhood matter. The confrontation had escalated, and Karen had physically shoved the woman, causing her to fall and break her wrist. The police had been called, but Karen had used her position in the HOA to avoid any serious repercussions. The case had been quietly swept under the rug, with the woman's injuries being dismissed as an unfortunate accident. Karen had gotten away with it, but the damage was done. The pattern of behavior was clear. I couldn't believe what I was reading. How had Karen gotten away with this for so long? How had the HOA and the neighborhood allowed her to continue terrorizing people without consequence? I felt a surge of anger rise within me, and I had to stop myself from slamming my fist down on the table. This was more than just an issue of a rude neighbor. This was about a woman who had preyed on others, using her power to ruin lives and make people feel helpless. But as the investigation progressed, a sense of justice began to take root in me. I realized that Karen's time of operating with impunity was over. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that her actions were not just damaging, they were criminal, and she was going to have to answer for them. The next step in the investigation was to gather statements from more people who had been affected by Karen's behavior. I had reached out to several neighbors, and soon more came forward. They were tired of being afraid, tired of being silenced. One man, named Mr. Thompson, shared a particularly disturbing story. He had been the recipient of Karen's wrath when he tried to make a modest renovation to his home. He had been working on a project to make his home more accessible for his elderly parents who were living with him. Karen had insisted that the construction violated HOA guidelines, even though the changes were minor and did not affect the overall appearance of the house. She had threatened to sue him, stating that she had connections in the HOA that would ensure he was fined into bankruptcy. Mr. Thompson had paid thousands of dollars in legal fees just to keep Karen at bay. the statements from the neighbors, combined with the legal records and criminal charges that were starting to pile up, were becoming a powerful case. I knew that this wasn't just about getting Karen removed from the HOA. This was about exposing her for what she truly was and making sure she never had the chance to hurt anyone again. The community needed to see her for what she was, a predator, not a protector. By the end of the week, I had compiled a stack of evidence so thick that it made my head spin. I had the legal reports, the witness statements, and the police records. It was all there. Karen had left a trail of destruction behind her, and now it was time to hold her accountable. But there was still one more thing I had to do before I could take this to the next level. I had to confront Karen directly. I had to give her the chance to answer for her actions before the case went to the HOA board and eventually the authorities. She had to know that her days of hiding behind her position were over. As I looked at the evidence one last time, I felt a deep sense of resolve. I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything Karen had done. She had crossed a line, and it was time to make sure she paid for it. The day of the final HOA hearing arrived, and my nerves were a mixture of anticipation and determination. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, carefully organizing my case, gathering evidence, and making sure everything was in place. There was no room for error today. It wasn't just about getting Karen removed from the HOA board. It was about ensuring that her reign of terror over the neighborhood came to an end. It was about standing up for my daughter, standing up for every person she had ever hurt, and making sure Karen would never be able to use her power to harm others again. I was ready. The community center felt cold and sterile as I entered the room where the hearing was taking place. The usual hum of suburban life outside seemed distant, as if everything had narrowed down to this one moment. I took my seat at the front, directly facing Karen, who was sitting across from me. She had a smug expression on her face, as if she thought she could still manipulate the situation, as if she could still control the outcome. But I knew better now. I had seen behind her mask, and today she would have to answer for her actions. The HOA president, Sarah, called the meeting to order. Her voice trembled slightly, but it was clear that she had come to understand the gravity of the situation. She wasn't just presiding over a typical neighborhood dispute anymore. This was something much bigger, and the people in the room knew it. They knew that this wasn't just about enforcing HOA rules, it was about holding someone accountable for their abuse of power. "Thank you, everyone, for attending," Sarah said, her voice steadying. "We are here today to address the serious accusations made against Karen Jenkins regarding her behavior toward a resident's child and the ongoing pattern of harassment and intimidation that has been reported. We will be reviewing the evidence and hearing from both sides before making a decision." I could feel the tension in the room, the weight of the eyes on me, on Karen. Everyone in this room had heard the rumors, seen the whispers, but now it was time for the truth to come out. I wasn't just here to defend myself or my daughter, I was here to bring the truth to light. Sarah turned to Karen, giving her the floor to speak first. Karen stood up, her posture stiff and defensive, as if she still believed she could somehow control the narrative. "I don't know why we're even having this meeting," Karen began, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is a ridiculous attempt to tarnish my reputation. All I did was try to teach that girl some respect. She was on my property playing with that toy car, and I told her to stop. When she didn't listen, I had no choice but to take action. It's not like she was seriously hurt. This is just being blown out of proportion." Her words rang hollow, and I could see the members of the HOA starting to shift in their seats, uncomfortable with her attempts to justify her actions. It was as if they were finally starting to see what I had seen all along. This wasn't about enforcing rules. It was about controlling and bullying those who were vulnerable. I stood up, calm but firm. "Karen, you didn't just slap my daughter. You humiliated her, and you made her feel like she didn't belong in this neighborhood, and what's worse, this wasn't the first time. You've done this before, many times. The evidence I've gathered shows a clear pattern of harassment, manipulation, and abuse of your position. You've used your power in this HOA to hurt people, to intimidate and bully them into silence. But today, that stops." I could feel the room shift as I spoke, the weight of my words sinking in. I wasn't just talking about the incident with Lily anymore. I was talking about everything Karen had done to the people in this neighborhood who didn't have the strength to fight back. The stories of neighbors who had been pushed out of Oakwood, the families who had suffered in silence, the countless people who had been made to feel like they didn't belong, because they didn't fit Karen's image of what the neighborhood should look like. Karen tried to interrupt, but the president held up a hand to stop her. The room fell into silence as the members of the HOA listened to the evidence being presented. I had compiled everything: the testimonies of neighbors, the police reports, the legal record showing Karen's past offenses. Each document was a nail in Karen's coffin, a clear and undeniable testament to her cruelty. As you can see, I continued, Karen has a history of using her position to manipulate and intimidate others. She has a criminal record, including charges of assault and harassment. These are not isolated incidents. They are part of a pattern of behavior that has been allowed to continue unchecked for far too long. And now, it's time for her to face the consequences. The room was still, the only sound being the rustling of papers as the board members reviewed the evidence. Karen's face had turned pale, her smug confidence now replaced with uncertainty. She knew she was losing control, and it was evident in the way her eyes darted nervously around the room. She had no more excuses, no more lies to tell. The HOA members began to speak one by one, voicing their concerns and agreeing with the points I had made. One of the members, Mr. Thompson, a longtime resident who had been a victim of Karen's bullying in the past, stood up. "I've had enough of Karen's behavior," he said. "I've been harassed by her for years. She's ruined my peace of mind, and she's driven good people out of this neighborhood. It's time for this to stop." Another board member, Mrs. Green, nodded in agreement. "I've heard enough. We cannot allow someone like Karen to continue holding a position of power in this community. She's caused nothing but division and pain." The weight of their words settled over the room like a heavy blanket, and Karen's face twisted in a mix of anger and disbelief. She was no longer in control. The people who had once been her allies were now turning against her. It was clear that the decision had already been made. The vote was taken, and it was unanimous. Karen was removed from her position on the HOA board, and she was banned from any further involvement in the community. The members of the HOA had finally found their voices, and they had chosen to stand on the side of justice. But that wasn't the end of it. I had made sure that Karen's criminal record had been shared with the authorities, and it didn't take long for the police to act. They arrested her for her previous offenses, including the assault charge that had been swept under the rug years ago. Karen, who had thought she was untouchable, was now facing the consequences of her actions. As I walked out of the meeting room, I felt a deep sense of relief wash over me. I had fought for my daughter, and I had won. The justice that had long been denied to others in this neighborhood had finally been served. I could see Lily waiting for me in the car, her bright eyes full of hope. She didn't fully understand what had happened, but I knew she felt it. She felt the weight of the injustice being lifted from her shoulders. She would never have to face Karen again, and the neighborhood could finally begin to heal. As I drove home, I looked at Lily in the rearview mirror. She was smiling, a soft, peaceful smile that reminded me of everything I had fought for. It wasn't just about the victory today. It was about her future, her happiness, and her safety. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like everything was going to be okay. The neighborhood would never be the same again, but neither would I. This was more than just a victory in a battle. It was a reminder that no matter how dark the world may seem, justice has a way of finding its light. If you've enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, make sure to subscribe to the HOA Stories. Join our community as we bring more powerful tales of standing up to bullies, facing adversity, and fighting for what's right. Don't miss out on the latest updates. Hit that follow button and stay tuned for more.